The next thing that we have to look at is to try and tease out some of those factors. We can use Super Rugby as a really good model. And so I looked at the Super 14 competition from 2006 to 2010. And I'm going to take you through that data now and begin with just an overview of Super Rugby and why it's such a good model. So Super 14 was a tournament played between 2006 and 2010 between teams from New Zealand, and there were five teams from South Africa and 4 teams from Australia. And I looked at the period over which the Super 14 was played. A 15th team was added in 2011 and 2 teams had been added in 2006. So the format of the tournament changes every few years, but I had a sample that had 65 matches per team, 33 of which were home or away, and I looked at the head-to-head results and analyzed them. Now the key thing about the Super 14 is that it's quite unique for 2 reasons. One is travel and the other is altitude. The first issue about travel is that in the Super 14, teams travel quite regularly from South Africa to New Zealand and Australia and vice versa. And so you have these up to 10-hour time differences that have to be dealt with. And a study by Dupree et al. In 2004 found that the cumulative travel is 38 time zones for the South African teams and 20 for New Zealand and Australia teams. We also found that there was no cumulative effect of fatigue as a result of travel, but the acute effect has not yet been documented. Then there's the altitude. Now, that's because 3 of the teams in the tournament play their matches at a relatively high altitude of 1,500 meters or higher. And so every team is guaranteed to play at least 2 or 3 matches at altitude per season. And we know that altitude has some questionable effects on performance in team sports. This is a table that I drew based on my analysis of the Football World Cup last year. And what you're looking at here in the darker shade is the high altitude matches, and in the lighter shade are the low altitude matches. And you can see that the total running distance by the football guys during a game, the high intensity distance, and the sprint running attempts are all reduced by 4, 11, and almost 12% respectively. And so quite clearly, playing at high altitude decreases the physiological capacity to play the sport. The question is whether that effect applies when a team from low altitude goes up to high altitude and whether that could give a team an advantage. Certainly does suggest it, but further research would be needed. The point I want to make here, though, is that each of these factors alone is unique, but in Super Rugby they exist in combination, and that makes Super Rugby quite a cool model to be able to study home ground advantage. So there are 3 approaches to doing this. The first one I call the commentator approach, and that's where you look at the data at face value and you ask a simple question: which teams have the strongest historical records at home? The second method, which I'll call the bookie approach, is to look at the odds of winning a match away from home relative to winning the match at home. And then the third approach I'll call the investment approach, which is to determine the value of playing at home. How many points is home ground advantage worth? So let's kick off with the commentator approach and have a look at some of the stats from the last 5 years. This is a table where you can see the winning percentage at home and away for each of the 14 teams, the South African, the New Zealand, and the Australian teams. And what you'll see if you just glance down this, you can find your favorite team on this if you'd like, is that the 89% by the Crusaders at home is the highest winning percentage, and the lowest winning percentage anywhere is the Lions, who've only won 12% of matches away from home. So how do we interpret this? Well, you ask yourself, first of all, what percentage is won at home, and the answer is 61. So that means that home ground advantage definitely exists, as it does for most other sports in the US, as I showed you earlier. The second thing you ask is, who do you fancy your chances playing against? Now it's obvious here that if you play the Blue Bulls, who we know win 79% of their matches at home, compared to playing against the Lions, who win only 31% of your matches at home, whenever you go up to Pretoria to play this team, you know that your chances of winning are substantially lower than beating this team even at their home venue. But it's important to understand that the reason for that is not necessarily home ground advantage. There are 2 things that influence your chances. And the main one is the strength of the opposition. Some teams, like the Bulls, are just so strong that it doesn't matter where you play them, you are not going to be the favorite to win that match. Other teams, like the Lions, historically have been the weakest team in the tournament, and so regardless of where you play them, home or away, you would back yourself to do well against them. And so the strength of the opposition is really important, and you have to factor that in. And the second issue is home ground advantage and how much of a relative effect it makes on a team. So that's the next issue that we have to do. But what we can do for the commentator approach is look at who plays in a fortress And those are these three teams: the South African home ground champions, the Australian champions, and the New Zealand's best team at home according to historical records. And then you can compare these to the teams that play in tin shacks, and you'll see that the Lions, for example, win 1 in 3 matches at home. The Cheetahs and the Highlanders win 2 out of every 5 matches at home. But as I said, the real issue is relative home versus away performances, and so that's what we look at second by taking the bookie approach. What are the chances of winning an away match relative to a home match? So this is the same table, but now what we introduce is something called the odds away ratio. So this value here, it's 0.65, is calculated by dividing the 52 by the 79%, and you get this ratio. And what this basically means are the odds that this team will win a match away compared to at home. So if there was no home ground advantage, this would be a 50-50 split, and the odds ratio would be 1. And if there was infinite home ground advantage, there would be 100% home wins and 0% away, and this ratio would be 0. So this value gives you an indication of how strong the team is away from home relative to at home. And so let's take an example. The Stormers have a ratio of 0.76, which means that if the probability of winning a home match is 60%, and that's an arbitrary number that I'm just making up to illustrate, then the odds of winning away are 46%, because it's 60 multiplied by their ratio of 0.76. In contrast, the Cheetahs have an odds ratio of 34%, and so the probability of winning a home match for them, if it was 60%, then the chances of winning away will be 20%, and that's 60 multiplied by, and forgive me, this is actually a typo, that should be 0.34. So 60 times 0.34 gives them a chance of 20. So quite clearly, the Stormers are more likely to win away than the Cheetahs are relative to when they play at home. So if we look at all those odds ratios, we get these teams highlighted in green. These are the teams who have the best likelihood of winning away matches. They are therefore the relatively good travellers, or the converse is that they have relatively less home ground advantage. It doesn't mean that they're easier to beat at home, it just means that relative to away, they have less advantage at home. And those are the teams there: Stormers, Chiefs, Waratahs and Force. And these are the teams in orange who are the lowest probability of winning away. They are therefore the poor travellers, and they therefore have relatively more home ground advantage. And so now it's interesting because the Cheetahs and Lions, both who have very poor records at home, actually have a higher advantage at home, and that's simply because while they may be bad at home, they're even worse away from home. Apologies to Lions and Cheetahs fans for saying that, but the stats seem to bear that out. And then the final approach, just to consolidate that, is the investment approach, where we look at how many points home ground advantage is worth. So this shows you the home ground average score and the away ground average score for the Crusaders over the course of the competition and all the 14 teams. So for example, the Crusaders at home average a 31-14 win, the Lions a 21-28 loss. And you'll see that most teams at home have winning records on average. It's different for the away records, because now you'll see that most teams in the red have losing records away. So the Lions, for example, have a losing record of 21 points away from home compared to only 7 points at home. Whereas the Crusaders, despite the fact that they win both, go from a 17-point win at home to a 3-point win away from home. And if you take the difference, the 17, and subtract the 3, then you get an indication of the value of being at home. And so that difference here is the home ground advantage in points. And so the Crusaders, Lions, Brumbies have a home ground points advantage of 14, and as we move down, we see that the Chiefs and the Stormers and the Highlanders are down at the bottom with 3 and 5 respectively. So for example, the Stormers win matches at home by 4 points and lose matches away by 1, and so being at home to them is worth about 5 points. And so overall, if you look at this, you have a home record of 26-21 victories for the home team, which means that the average home ground advantage in the Super 14 has been 10 points. In terms of fortresses and tin shacks, we can now combine the methods and say, let's look at relative home strength. This is the ranking. The Cheetahs have the strongest relative record at home, then the Reds, Lions and Brumbies. And if we look at the bottom 4, we get Force, Waratahs, Stormers and Chiefs. Just again, remember, this doesn't mean that they are the strongest at home. It just means that relative to being away, they have the strongest records at home. And we can give some possible reasons for that. It's interesting to note that the Cheetahs are an altitude team, The Lions are an altitude team. The Force, who are down in 11th, are a new team, and therefore they may not have a home identity. And quite honestly, I don't know the reason why these teams would be down below and have the lowest relative home advantage, and nor do I know why the Brumbies and Reds are there. That may be something for future research to look at. Let's just have a look at home ground value in terms of points. And once again, you'll see the same team names up here. So the Lions are second, Brumbies third, Cheetahs fourth. So these are the three teams that, no matter which method we use, feature as having the strongest relative home ground advantage. And at the bottom, you see the Stormers and Chiefs come up on both sides. And so these are the teams that have the lowest or smallest home ground advantage relative to how they play away from home.